Take two. In our first session, we were talking about the considerations. What one thing would you choose if given the chance to make your church great? And with all the various considerations and concerns, they end up being more focused on self. And that's really not where ministry and mission should not be. And what we tend to do is we begin then to worry when the greatness doesn't come out, in yourself or in the people among you in your church and what you're trying to do. But there is one thing, I really should say, there is one person who upends this worry every single time. Because God approaches us. He approaches us regardless of our success or our failure. He approaches us regardless of our strength or our frailty. Because what God does is He breaks into our midst. And He breaks into the midst of our complication and confusion, so often that which we cause ourselves. Because God desires to input His discernment in what we do in being church. And as God breaks into that midst, He causes us to be like Solomon in that dream where he came to him. And what begins to happen is that we recount and we recall what God has already done. As Solomon did when he recounted what God had done for his father David. But then we also begin to realize that you and I are inadequate. Like Solomon said, I'm but a child. Even though he wasn't, he just felt that way going into this kingship. And not knowing the ins and outs of how to rule. And finally, in that dream, Solomon remembered God's promises. And as we do the same thing in the midst of God's mission and ministry in our church, in our locations, we recount what God has already done. We realize our own inadequacy, but then we remember God's promises. That's wisdom. That's God's wisdom, not the earthly wisdom that we so often hear. It's God's wisdom because it's a God-listening heart which leads to a people understanding mind. It's putting God's kingdom first. Putting His purposes, putting His will, putting His desires to draw all people to Himself. Putting that first in what we need to do and be as church. And as He molds and shapes our heart in that way, then we become more attentive, more receptive, and more responsive to the need of our neighbor and the need of our community. Thereby, He creates that people understanding mind in us. Ultimately, He leads us to making faithful choices in what we do for His mission and ministry. We're not always going to make probably the right choice, but it will always be a faithful choice because it's due to a God-listening heart and then trying to serve His purpose and understanding His people. Sometimes it's the choice between two competing goods. Sometimes it's the lesser of two evils. But nonetheless, as God leads us in His wisdom, it's to lead us to serve His people and ultimately His kingdom.